Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Derek. Thank you all for attending the talk, and thank you for everyone watching online. I'm really glad to be here to share a few ideas about technology, policy, and how we need to upgrade our institutions in these times of radical change. To start discussing that, I'd like you to picture a runner, one of those runners here. So it's not a runner that's running a 5-kilometer race or a sprint or even a marathon. It's a runner that's into what is known as ultra running, that is a very long race that drags through the day and the night. And anyone here run that kind of race? Oh, you do, so you're in better shape than me. And you can relate to what I have in mind. So the idea here is that to run that kind of race, ultra running, you need more than being in great shape. You need, you need a compass, you need a map, you need a headlamp to help you see through the night. And the reason I'm mentioning this today is because I think we together as a society are currently involved in that kind of race. And it's a race that is very much about economic development. It's a long race because it's a race that can be seen as being divided into two parts. So the first part of this ultra running towards economic development in the digital economy is about building great tech companies. And you here in the Bay Area have been very good at doing that. But there's a second part of that race, which is about inventing or discovering the institutions that will make the new economy more sustainable and more inclusive. And that's a discussion or conversation we in Europe, because I'm European, you can hear that from my accent, we in Europe are very keen to have that kind of conversation about new institutions for the digital economy. And so, and if we want to win, if we want our Western countries to remain the most advanced economies in the world, the most sustainable economies in the world, and the most inclusive economies in the world, we really need to be ready to run that very long race that's divided into two parts. So as for me, so I'm the co-founder and director of a firm called The Family. So we're based in Europe. We have offices in London, where I live, in Paris, where we founded the firm 6 years ago, and in Berlin, in Germany, and in Brussels as well. And what we're doing in Europe is supporting ambitious entrepreneurs across Europe, entrepreneurs who want to build large pan-European tech companies. But before doing that, I have a kind of a background in policy and government because I used to be trained in the French civil service. I actually worked for more than 5 years for the French government before joining the tech world. And so I have this mixed background that makes me interested in both parts of the race. The part that is about building tech companies and the other part that is about discovering new institutions to make our economy more developed, more sustainable, and more inclusive. And I've written this book, Hedge, which was published last year, to share, to try and invite everyone in the tech world to participate in that race that we have to run if we want our economies to be more balanced and more stable and more rewarding for the many as opposed to the few. And so I'd like to share a few ideas about what's in the book today. So first of all, it's a book that I wrote to address an American audience. It relies on what I used to study in the past about American history, American politics. So I've tried to use all that knowledge of this great country, the US, to try and address that audience that is so different from a European audience in terms of interests, in terms of perspectives, experiences, and so on. And that's because I think the US has a critical, unique contribution to make to winning that two-part race. And there are 3 reasons for that. So the first reason is that the US has a large, successful, thriving local tech industry. And it's a very important part of discovering new institutions because if you have a government like we have in Europe that tries to invent and to design new institutions without having large tech companies that are local and that they, domestic and that they can rely on for insight, for knowledge, for direction, for making sure that the new institutions are really in line with how we create value in the new economy, how we produce, how we consume, how we work. Well, the institutions that will come out of this effort will be ill-designed and not aligned with what the new economy is about. So because the US has a thriving tech industry, part of it is located here in the Bay Area, it's really well ahead in terms of being able to design new institutions. And that's the first reason why we really need, as the world, the US to participate in that. The second reason why the US is so interesting in that regard, it's that there's a federal system here. And when you talk about government designing new institutions, it's not only about the federal government in Washington, D.C. It's also about the 50 states and the large cities that all have the legal and financial power to make experiments in terms of policy, to try and tackle the problems in an innovative way, and to eventually discover the new institutions that then can be scaled up at the federal level. So this is a picture of Louis Brandeis. He was the first Jewish person to be appointed to the US Supreme Court early in the 20th century. And I'm using his picture here because he's the one who coined this very interesting concept of the 50 states or the American states as laboratories of democracy. And that's because he was a keen believer in the federal system and was very interested in the capacity to experiment with new policies on the ground at the state level or at the local level, and then get inspiration from that to scale up new policies and new institutions. And so the US has that. You have a domestic thriving tech industry. You have a federal system that provides room for many experiments in policy. And third, well, you already did that the previous time when we went through radical change economically, politically, in terms of technology as well at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, the US was a pioneer at the time in terms of reacting to that change by designing new institutions to try and balance that new economy that nobody really understood. And so it's what I call the Great Safety Net 1.0. It was first designed here in the US, and then it provided inspiration for other countries in the world. And it is known by historians as the Second New Deal. So this is actually a picture of President Roosevelt signing an act known as the Social Security Act. Behind him is Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor at the time, the first woman to be appointed to cabinet. And the Second New Deal was, well, many different policies and many different decisions that together formed the new social contract, which enabled the US to succeed economically and politically in the decades after that. And so there was Social Security, obviously. There was government support for banks issuing mortgages with Fannie Mae and later Freddie Mac. There was upgraded banking regulations. There was assistance from the government to unions so that unions could bargain with employers. And all that together formed what I call the Great Safety Net 1.0. And so what about that Great Safety Net 1.0? So I'd like to share two ideas about that today. First, it used to be incredible. It worked extremely well in terms of providing support to everyone, households, businesses, and making it possible for the economy to thrive. But second, today it's obsolete because the economy has recently gone through radical change. It's not the same that it was at the time of the Second New Deal, obviously. And so we need to be ready to upgrade that Great Safety Net and go from 1.0 to 2.0. But before that, or before discussing that, I'd like to share a few ideas about what was the Great Safety Net 1.0. So the first thing that you should have in mind here is that it was designed around the large corporations of the time, the Fordist corporations that were mostly about mass production of tangible goods in large factories along assembly lines. And so the Great Safety Net was designed, was very much focused on the people working in those corporations, mainly factory workers working along assembly lines. And because the new safety net lifted those workers up, through those, because they were the most critical part of the workforce at the time, working for the most productive corporations of the time, they lifted everyone up, or almost everyone, at least the majority of workers. And so the Great Safety Net, designed for those people, those factory workers, relied on three pillars. That's the model I've been developing in the book. So the first pillar was about covering those people against critical risks. And it was all, it relied on a concept known by policy wonks as social insurance. So social insurance was about providing coverage against critical risks. So for instance, if you were too old to work because you didn't have the stamina and strength anymore to be able to work along assembly lines, very physical, demanding work, then the state would provide you with a pension. Or you were sick or you were hurt at the factory, then the insurance regime would provide you with money to pay the rent and with and access to affordable care so that you can get back in shape and get back to work. Or if you lost your job, they'll provide you with unemployment benefits so that, again, you can pay the rent and maybe learn new skills before you find a new job. So that was all social insurance, and the feature, what it performed was covering people against critical risks. The second pillar was the financial system. And the financial system is part of the Great Safety Net because it provides people with access to capital whenever they need it. And so why did you need access to capital in the Fordist economy in the 20th century? You needed access to capital when you wanted to buy a house, and a house, especially here in the US, was an extremely critical part of economic security for households. But no one could buy a house paying cash. You needed to borrow money from a bank issuing a mortgage. And those mortgages were operated by the private sector, but they were made possible by government-sponsored institutions such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so it's not because it's the private sector that it's not part of the Great Safety Net. The Great Safety Net effectively included a significant segment of private business delivering economic security and support to households. You also needed money to buy a car. A car in the past used to be critical because you needed that car to go from home to work, to school, to shopping mall, to baseball stadium. Without a car, you couldn't access all the opportunities, and you couldn't find a job in the Fordist economy. So the financial system was here to provide access to capital. And the third pillar of the Great Safety Net 1.0 was strong trade unions. And they became strong following the New Deal in the US because they were assisted by the government, which provided them with the strength and the credit to be able to bargain with employers. And the reason why unions were critical in that complex nexus of institutions is because, the version of the Great Safety Net that was designed right after the New Deal in the 1930s was designed for the economy of the time. But then the economy, over the course of decades, went through several waves of radical change. And each time you needed to upgrade the social contract to make the institutions work for the economy of the day. And so you needed someone to take care of that, to push in favor of upgrading the institutions and the rules and regulations. And trade unions were the one who delivered results at least until the 1970s. And so that's what I call the Great Safety Net 1.0. It was designed sometime in the 1930s to deliver good jobs, a steady income, and economic security to most workers in the context of the Fordist economy, or what economist Carlota Perez calls the age of the automobile and mass production. And that worked incredibly well for several decades, but today it's obsolete. And to understand why it's obsolete, we need to revisit the various pillars and realize how the economy has changed and why those legacy institutions don't deliver anymore. So first, let's start with social insurance. So one main reason why social insurance regimes are obsolete today is because we can't fund them anymore. This is a picture that shows you the projected evolution of the US federal public debt. And most of that growing debt that you see here is because of Social Security and Medicare. And the reason why we have those funding problems with social insurance is because the tax system has not been designed for today's economy. It was designed to tax households and business in the Fordist economy, organized mostly around manufacturing. But today, the economy is not like that anymore. And so we have a hard time, governments have a hard time generating fiscal revenue to pay for covering risks for the many. That's one problem that we have with social insurance today. Another problem is that we don't cover against today's risks. There are risks that still exist, like you can still be too old to be able to work. You can still get sick and then you need care. But there are certain risks that we're still focusing on, that are not that critical anymore. So I wanted to show you that picture of Julius Yego, who's also known as YouTube Man, by the way, because he learned to throw the javelin by watching videos of athletes on YouTube, and he went on to become an Olympic champion himself a few years back. And so it's an exceptional case, and not everyone is like him, being able to learn from watching videos on YouTube. But what it suggests, I think, is a very important idea. It's that today, in the digital economy, because we have so many resources online to learn new skills, to discover new activities, to spot interesting opportunities, losing your job and not having the right skills is not as critical a risk anymore. And so governments are very much focused on that, like reskilling the workforce, developing the workforce. But in fact, the workforce today has access to many resources that make it easier for them to learn new skills and to move on the labor market. So it's a risk that used to be critical, but that is not critical anymore today. On the other hand, there are risks that weren't that critical in the past that are becoming more critical today. And I think that the next frontier when it comes to covering risks is the housing market. So we're in San Francisco, so you obviously know that prices go up constantly. It makes it difficult for people to afford housing. It makes it difficult for people who are not here to move here to seize the many opportunities that are provided by a vibrant economy like the one in San Francisco. And this is typical of a risk that wasn't that critical in the past, because in the past, in an economy dominated by factories, most people lived in suburban areas. And in suburban areas, land is cheap. And so so there wasn't that tension on the housing market that exists today, because today most jobs, more and more opportunities are located in large cities. And that's why most workers are flocking into those cities and trying to afford housing, and because we don't build enough, and because most regulations on the housing market are obsolete, and because we didn't design the right institutions to make for a more welcoming urban housing market for workers, well, a lot of people cannot afford housing where there are jobs and opportunities for them. So this is typical of a risk that wasn't that critical in the past, but is becoming more critical as the economy becomes more urban. And that calls for designing a new kind of social insurance to cover people against the risks of not being able to afford housing where there are jobs and opportunities for them. So that's for social insurance. Now, let's move to the financial system. The financial system, the legacy financial system, and the part that we're interested in here, that is consumer finance, is obsolete as well because it provides us with capital to invest in assets that are not that critical anymore. So for instance, it makes it quite easy, the financial system makes it easy to buy a house in suburban areas. But today, as I mentioned, most jobs in the digital economy are located in cities. So you're not interested in a mortgage that makes it possible for you to buy a house in suburbia. You want to live in the city, and no bank will be able to lend you the money to do that. Another thing that's even less critical is the car. So there are many cars here parked near those houses, and when you lived in suburban areas, it was critical to own a car, but most people living in cities today know that owning a car is more a problem than a solution to in your everyday life, because it costs a lot of money. You don't know where to park it. There's congestion on the roads, etc. So you prefer to rely on public transit or ride-hailing or car sharing or other solutions, and owning a car is not that critical anymore. But on the other hand, there are things that we'd like to invest in today that the banking system and consumer finance don't provide capital for, like switching jobs. In our more entrepreneurial economy, we have to hop from job to job more often, far more often than in the past. But switching job is not only like I quit my job and I find another one. In many cases, it's about taking some time off to reflect on what I'd like to do, maybe learning new skills on YouTube or in learning communities, and then maybe move to another city. But if you have a family, you need to bring your spouse, and your spouse needs to find a new job as well. And then you need to bring your kids, and your kids need to move to a new school. So all in all, it costs a lot of money, but switching jobs. But if you go to a bank and you say to your banker, I'd like to switch job, and I'd like you to lend me some money to cover the costs of doing that, they won't lend you the money, because we never created something equivalent to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, but to provide people with capital to switch jobs. And so that's typical of an ill-designed financial system when it comes to today's economy. The other reason why the financial system is obsolete today is because it's overstretched. So it all led us, this is a woman protesting Wall Street right after the financial crisis 10 years ago. And the financial crisis can very much be read as the result of relying too much on the financial system to provide people with capital and economic security at the expense of the other pillars. So we've neglected social insurance by not funding it and upgrading it. We've neglected unions that have been basically wiped out of the map. And we've relied too much on only one pillar out of the three, the financial system, to provide economic security to people. And this is why the burden became too heavy for the system to support. And it all collapsed in 2008, leading us into the Great Recession. Finally, well, unions are obsolete, but for obvious reasons. They're defending jobs that mostly don't exist anymore, or that are the minority on today's labor market. Their preferred means of action, like going on strike, are also obsolete, considering what the economy is about today. Their strongholds are old legacy exhausted industries, as opposed to new industries and thriving industries. And so trade unions, as they are today, have a hard time staying relevant for workers. So all in all, it's all obsolete. But to understand how we can upgrade that safety net and move from great safety net 1.0 to Great Safety Net 2.0. So there's a lot about that in the book. I've been trying in the book to explain what the new economy is about, how we create value in the new economy, how production, consumption, work, relationships between individuals and organizations have changed. But because I don't have the time to share everything that's in the book today, I'd like to focus on one framework that's in the book, and this is the framework of hunters and settlers. And it's one very important way in which our world has changed through the paradigm shift from the Fordist economy to today's digital economy. So in the past, the economy was dominated by settlers. And the reason for that is that at the center of the economy, the most critical part of the economy was large industrial corporations. And those corporations were so strong and so resilient and also very rigid as a result of that, but that they could basically survive over the course of decades without having to invent themselves too much. And so because they provided the stability, everyone wanted to work for those corporations. That's where you had the highest wages, the more benefits, the more economic security. And because those corporations were about large factories or large office buildings, you could really settle around them. Like, I'm going to work for this employer, I'm going to buy a house nearby, I'm going to find a school for my kids nearby, and that's it. I'm settled, my life is settled. I'm going to have that job for life and have a career with the same employer. And at the margin of the economy were the hunters, the ones who were moving constantly from one city to another, from one job to another, from one industry to another. And so most hunters were like students trying new jobs while still attending a university, or migrants, or well, at the high end of the hunting way of life, where the people taking planes, moving from five-star hotel to five-star hotel because they worked in consulting or finance or other things. But that's very much how the economy was organized. So at the center were the large corporations, around them were the settlers, and then at the margin of the economy were the hunters. And the institutions that we had at the time were extremely rewarding for settlers because that was the norm, that was the preferred way of life. Today, the economy has been turned upside down. And so I won't go into the details, but I'm happy to discuss that if we have time for questions. But one key idea that's in the book is that the large corporations have been replaced as the center of the economy by networked individuals. I think that the most important player in today's economy is not the large companies anymore. It's we individuals, because we're more equipped with powerful computing devices, and we're all connected together through networks. And that provides us with a lot of power. And the organizations and the work, and the organizations that dominate today's economy are precisely the ones that have realized that there's no more power in networked individuals, and that have been deploying their operations so as to harness that power vested in networked individuals. But because networked individuals, well, they don't. There's not the stability that existed with large Fordist corporations anymore. It's a network, so it's constantly moving, displaced, fragmented, reorganized, and people connected through those networks are more and more impatient. They want to be served faster with better services at a cheaper price. And so to be able to compete in that economy, you need to be ready to be entrepreneurial. And that's the key thing. That's, by the way, that's the reason why I've decided to call the new economy the entrepreneurial age. That's because I think, that's not because I think we'll all become entrepreneurs in that economy. It's because I'm I'm convinced that we'll all work for more entrepreneurial firms, firms that will design themselves so as to be able to constantly innovate, so as to better serve that multitude of connected individuals. And so when the economy is about connected individuals, networked individuals, certainly the hunters, those who are ready to hop from job to job, to seize opportunities, to come up with new ideas, to be more entrepreneurial in their working life, are rewarded because they're the best able to interact with that very important group that is now at the center of our economy, the networked individuals. And so this is why the economy is now turned upside down. It's because at the center there are the networked individuals. Then the most critical part of the workforce is now the hunters, people that are moving from opportunity to opportunity, that are flexible, that are able to rebound in an economy that's more unstable because it's more entrepreneurial. And so the settlers, those who really want to stay in place and to keep the same job and to live in the same house, are now at the margin, suffering because they're not able to seize those opportunities provided by this more entrepreneurial economy. So that's the framework I've been using, and I think it's important to have that in mind because it helps us realize how we should revisit and reinvent the various pillars of the safety net. And so if you go back through those, realizing that at the center of the economy are not it's not factory workers anymore, but it's networked individuals, you need to revisit every pillar and to realize that they should be redesigned to better serve the needs of hunters in an economy driven by computing and networks. So what about social insurance? Well, social insurance should cover us against the risks that are associated with the hunting way of life. And I think, again, that housing, urban housing, is the new frontier here. We really need new institutions to make it possible for people hunting from job to job to afford housing where there are jobs and opportunities for them. The financial system should provide us with capital to become better hunters. Today, it provides us with capital to buy a house or to buy a car, which is not about hunting at all. It should provide us with capital for whenever we want to switch job, to switch careers, or to move from one city to another. Capital to take time off, to learn new skills, to move your entire family from one city to another. And this means that we should invent something like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but to provide capital for hunters rather than settlers. And finally, the trade unions. Well, imagine if the trade unions, instead of defending workers where they are and trying to support them as settlers, became platforms to help workers rebound from job to job and to leave the industries and the companies that treat them badly to join other industries where they can find better jobs, better opportunities. It's a very different kind of union. It's not the same as the industrial unions that dominated the Fordist economy, but it wouldn't be the first time that trade unions or worker organizations reinvent themselves to account for a paradigm shift. And so this is what we should keep in mind. So now, the reason, so I said that my book was written to address an American audience, but it particularly addresses a segment of that audience, and that is people working in the US tech industry. So entrepreneurs, tech employees, tech investors, and that's because I think entrepreneurs can really make a difference in discovering the institutions that together form the new safety net. They're already at work doing that because entrepreneurs and tech companies in general master the art of solving problems by using technology and coming up with innovative solutions. And so I've made a list, so I'm constantly updating the list of the many startups that, in my view, are working hard as we speak at designing the new safety net or discovering new solutions that maybe at some point could scale up and form the new safety net. So Lambda School is a startup that provides people with the opportunity to learn new skills, code, and in exchange for a fraction of their future income if they find a job. And so I position them here between the financial system and trade unions because they're effectively a financial institution. They provide you with the money to learn new skills, and you can pay them back later. But they're also a bit like a trade union because they have this very strong community of people learning to code together, and they provide them with the support they need to find job and they have a clear interest in you finding the best paying job because, again, they're rewarded with a fraction of your income. So that's an example. Another example is Earnin. So it's a startup that's helping gig workers and freelancers even their income and employees be paid when earlier without having to wait for their paycheck at the end of the week or the end of the month. Safety Wing is a startup that provides insurance products for digital nomads. You have many startups in the real estate space, like Point or DV Homes. You have Trupo, which provides freelancers with a disability insurance. You have Landed, which is trying to help people that are not paid as much as tech engineers, like teachers, nurses, and so on, to find housing where they are needed, etc., etc. So Oscar is active in the health space, and there are many others. So what I really wanted to stress here is that it's not only about the government, it's about all of us together. We're all in that ultra running race together. And people that are interested in tech and that have already succeeded in tech should pay more attention to the institutional part of the race. And people that are involved in policy and regulations and government should pay more attention to what is happening in the tech world. And we should all share that knowledge to be able to run that race together. So I think it's important, and I think it's urgent, by the way. So my book was published last year. I think today it's even more relevant for many reasons. So we're moving forward to the next presidential election here in the US. So there's already a lot of conversations going on about what the new policy should be regarding the tech industry, but how to upgrade the social contract as well. There's the rise of China, and China in many ways is inventing their own version of the Great Safety Net 2.0 because they're already succeeding in the digital economy, and they really need to provide their people with stability and balance and inclusiveness and so on. There's Brexit, there's populism all around the world, etc. So this is a picture of Karl Polanyi, who was an economic historian known for one book called The Great Transformation, which was published in 1944, the last century. And it's a book that explains why the shift to the Fordist paradigm early in the 20th century led to the rise of fascism and ultimately to World War II. And it's because there was a mismatch in many countries, not the US, because the US had the New Deal, but in many other countries, especially in Europe, there was a mismatch between what the new economy was about, the new risks to which people were exposed, the new problems they encountered in their daily life, and there was a mismatch with the institutions. So the institutions couldn't provide people with the support and stability that they needed, and it all led to a lot of pain, suffering, anger, and ultimately to the rise of fascism. So I think it's an urgent discussion. It's even more urgent today. We're still in the race to make the West, what it used to be, that is the most advanced and the most inclusive and the most sustainable economy on Earth. And I think we should, so remember that runner that I talked about at the beginning of my talk. I think what we should have in mind is that it's a relay race. It's a race when we have to pass the baton many times from people who know technology to people who know policy to people that are ready to bridge the gap between those two worlds. And my book, in many ways, is a map for you to run that race. So I invite you to have a look at it, especially if you work in tech as an employee, an entrepreneur, or an investor, and participate in that race to help us win it together. Thank you. And I have time for questions if you have them.
Thanks so much for your talk. My name is Dash. So I am kind of leaning on your question around settlers and hunters. I found it interesting that you had technology companies on the periphery, and I was wondering if you could speak more to that. This is not an egoistic question, knowing that we're here at Google. It seems as if the framework that you provided has tech companies at the center, and center in the way of empowering this kind of mesh network of people. And so that's definitely a positive centering for tech companies, but we were also seeing a negative centering of tech companies. I'm not sure. And by that I mean, yes, I can be networked, but if I'm networked in the sharing economy, so I have a mobile phone, but let's say I'm an Uber driver and I don't have, yes, I have access to information to switch jobs, my current status in life doesn't allow me the kind of the exit power to do that. And so could you speak a little bit more to why you believe tech companies are on the periphery, and maybe speak a little bit more nuanced in terms of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing? Should it be regulated? Should there be more inroads between the kind of the big tech companies and new upstarts that are trying to provide new institutions to empower more people?
So what I think, to try and reformulate what I said before, is that to be at the center of this new economy, or as close to the center as possible, you need to be entrepreneurial. And being entrepreneurial doesn't mean being a tiny startup. You can be entrepreneurial in a large organization. But being entrepreneurial means that you need to be ready to evolve at the pace of the multitude of networked individuals. Because again, they're constantly demanding better products at a cheaper price. They want to be served faster. They want new features, new bundles, new services, etc. And you can only afford being close to them if you're able to deliver that. And so that's why the economy is becoming more and more entrepreneurial. It's because most large organizations have a hard time serving that multitude of demanding networked individuals. And so I have a few cases in mind. I think a company like Amazon has done a great job scaling up while retaining that capacity to constantly innovate and to question its business model and to reinvent itself or expand onto new markets on a constant basis. But the danger that large organizations are exposed to is that as they become larger, they embark a lot of rigidity and a lot of processes, and they become complacent, and they have difficulties to change, to expand, to explore new territories, to learn from their failures, and so on. And so I think that's the challenge that every large tech company has to tackle. Do they want to remain close to the center? That is, and for that they need to be more entrepreneurial. Or if they're not entrepreneurial enough, they'll have the stability and the security that comes with many assets, a strong balance sheet, and employing many people. But they also have the rigidity that makes them less relevant to the networked individuals at the center. And so I think that it's a good thing that tech companies are moving toward the center, because at the center, you basically submit to what networked individuals want. And so it's an entirely different field of discussion, like antitrust and breaking up tech companies and stuff like that. But I think that the networked individuals are now strong enough to make sure that the companies that sell them act in their best interests. And what is lacking is only the institutions to make it possible to provide those people with stability, security, and the capacity to exit. So you mentioned those Uber drivers. They're very close to the center. They're serving demanding networked individuals. They're also networked themselves as drivers, as a company. But they don't have the safety net that provides them with the stability and the security and the support they need to make the most of their current situation and maybe rebound to more rewarding positions in the economy. So this is why we need to invent this new safety net. It's simply to acknowledge that the workforce has moved from factories to urban proximity services, and to provide those what's now the majority of the workforce, that is proximity service workers, with the support they need to become the new middle class. This is really what's at stake here.
I had a question regarding your book. You began your book with a personal anecdote about when you were summoned to court for an alleged defamation against a leading figure in the French taxi industry. Do instances like this make you feel that corporations are in fact trying to put a stop on those innovations?
So I think, yes, so there's this anecdote which dates back like 6 years ago when we founded our firm in Paris. At exactly the same time, I wrote a blog post that I put online criticizing the CEO of the largest taxi company in Paris, because he was introducing himself in videos and interviews as the king of innovation, if you will, explaining how his taxi company was innovating so much. And what I wrote was that in these interviews there was a deep misunderstanding of what innovation was about. And if we relied on such people to innovate, well, we as a country, France and Europe in general, will keep on lagging behind the US and China. And so he didn't like my blog post and sued me in court, and I was cleared later, so that ended up okay. But I introduced the book with this anecdote to try and share with an American audience what it's like to work in tech in Europe. Again, we don't have large tech companies like you have here. And so but we have many startups and many entrepreneurs that realize that you can use technology in an innovative way and tackle problems that were previously without a solution. The problem is that those entrepreneurs have to battle against powerful incumbents that have everything to lose with the economy changing. They don't want those startups entering their markets. They don't want the value chain to be redesigned according to the needs of networked individuals. And they want regulations to preserve the status quo as opposed to lifting everyone up. And so in Europe, we have to, so you have that in the US, but it's rather new. It's called the backlash against technology. And tech companies have been adapting the past 2 years to that new context in which they encounter hostility from basically everyone, from every part of the political spectrum and so on. This is new in the US, but in Europe, it's always been like that. And so we who work in tech in Europe, we're used to battling against a hostile environment and to force innovation, not only by building great startups, that eventually become great companies, but also by sharing that narrative that basically conveys the message that startups are not only about disruption and destruction and invading your privacy and destroying jobs. No, startups are the vanguard of a new world which will reward all of us with sustainability and inclusiveness if we run the two parts of the race. The first part, again, that is building great companies, thriving companies, and the other part is inventing new institutions.
A quick question that I'm constantly struggling is how you see the paradox of having institutions that need to regulate the tech industry that is moving so fast, and you have like institutions that take long time to make any decision?
It's a good question because one of the features of the Fordist economy was that it was a very stable economy. The only thing that was unstable was consumer demand. And the Great Safety Net 1.0 was precisely designed to provide stability on consumer markets, to make it possible for industrialists to invest, to plan ahead and to invest over the long term. Because they could, thanks to the safety net and the stability and the security that it provided to everyone, they could count on sustained consumer demand over the course of years or decades. Today, so we had stability on the production side or supply side, and instability on the demand side. And the economy became more stable because we corrected the instability on the demand side by building new institutions. Today, the problem we have is that there's instability everywhere. Like the supply side is unstable because of increasing returns to scale and network effects. The demand side is still unstable because people are changing constantly and want new products and new services and have new ideas constantly. And so how do you provide stability in such an economy? And how do you design stable institutions that pass the test of time? I don't know, actually. This is why we really need to run that race and to enter the discovery process, and that goes through trials and errors and errors and errors before we finally discover what works. But what I'm convinced of is that you can design institutions for an unstable economy with the goal of providing stability. So there's this concept by Nassim Taleb called anti-fragile. And so anti-fragile is not robust. It's how do you survive in a world that's constantly changing, in which you have to reinvent yourself and rebound and get back on your feet throughout many ups and downs and booms and busts. And so it's an interesting concept because this is really what's at stake here. We need to design institutions that will provide the stability that's missing in an economy dominated by computing and networks. And maybe those institutions, so that one part of the book discusses the relevance of the state. Like the last time, stability was provided by the state because the state was the largest top-down organizations there was in a given country. And so how could you regulate the Fordist economy that was dominated by large top-down organizations by inviting the largest of those organizations to enact the rules and to watch over the various players? Today, I'm not certain the state is the player able to deliver that. Maybe the new institutions will be designed by a complex nexus of different organizations, like acting like platforms. So individuals themselves, the new unions, tech companies, and government all together will design that process of upgrading institutions to account for the fast pace of change in the economy. It's not a top-down approach. In an economy dominated by networked individuals, you can't regulate that economy with a top-down approach. And that's very much the problem we have on both sides of the Atlantic. So in Europe, we don't really get that. So we're trying to do what we did so well the last time, that is, have the state come up with regulations imposed from the top down, and it will provide balance. Here in the US, you have a better understanding of what's going on, but the government is still far removed from the tech industry and doesn't interact enough with that industry to realize that maybe the top-down approaches at enacting regulations don't work anymore. So there's a lot of work to do. Again, keep in mind that that kind of work is not only done here in the West, it's also done in China, in Southeast Asia, and maybe they'll come up with the new designs before we do, and they'll invent their own version of the safety net, and they'll race ahead in the towards economic development, while we in the West will be lagging behind. So that's very much what's at stake here.
All right. With that, let's thank him one more time